of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So, for those of you who are here every week at this 11 o'clock Eucharist, you see the deacon bear this book into the room and thrown it on the altar, and we honor this book with incense. It's the book from which the gospel is proclaimed every week. But this book is not a book of the Gospels. In other words, if you open this book, what you have in this book is not simply the four Gospels in order. This is not a book of the Gospels. This is what we call a gospel book. And what that means is that if you look in this book, so for example, if you look here today, here's the Gospel for the second Sunday of Advent. But what comes next is the Gospel for the third Sunday of Advent, and then the Gospel for the fourth Sunday of Advent. And here are all the Gospels for Christmas, and then Epiphany, and so it goes. So it's just chunks. It's just bits and pieces of the Gospels cut out and pasted together in the order that we read them in the liturgical year. This is called a gospel book. These books have existed for a very long time, and if you go to the Met, the next time you go to the Met, or especially the next time you go to the cloisters, go in search of gospel books. There are plenty of them there. They're usually beautiful things, illuminated, just wonderful books. Go and look, and there you will find them. And I'm going to tell you something. They'll probably have them open in a display case so that you can see them. And no matter which page they're open, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which page they're open to. It doesn't matter which feast. It just doesn't matter. I'm going to tell you that I know, it's like Karnak, I know the first three words of any gospel that you come across. And the first three words of each of the gospels will be in illo tempore. In illo tempore. And that means at that time. The deacon, when he opened the book to read the gospel, would always begin the passage by saying, in illo tempore, at that time. And this is more than just a literary device. It's more than just a liturgical formula. It actually makes a point. And the point it makes is that what we are about to hear is not a fairy tale. This really happened. There was an actual time in illo tempore. There was a day when this actually happened. These are not like fairy tales that we know didn't ever happen, but neither are they like the stories of the gods on Mount Olympus, the stories of Zeus, where human time and human lives really have no access and have no meaning. The stories of the gospel are human stories that happen in human time, so much so that theoretically you can pinpoint when this happened. You can pinpoint when this happened. Now, I think Luke is doing something similar today when he begins his gospel. You remember how Luke begins this passage that we heard today. He tells us about when John the Baptist appeared on the scene. And this is not the beginning of Luke's gospel. This is 3 chapters in. There's been plenty before. But what Luke wants to do now is he wants to say to us, I'm about to tell you something, and don't you doubt for a minute, this happened. I'm going to give you the date when this happened. And he says, what does he say? He says that it happened during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was governor of Galilee, and his brother Philip was ruler of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis. And it goes on and on. Luke goes on and on, giving us a way to pinpoint when this happened. He even listed the high priests at the time, Annas and Caiaphas, because Luke wants us to understand that John the Baptist is not some fairy tale, that John the Baptist's ministry actually happened, and it happened in a very particular, very real time. And it was not a good time. It was not a good time. You don't need to know much about Roman history or Jewish history at the time of Jesus' earthly life. to know that Tiberius and Pilate and Herod and Annas and Caiaphas, you know the stories. These were not the friends of the Jews. And they certainly would not turn out to be the friends of Jesus and his disciples. And then poor John the Baptist. You know, the fact that Luke mentions that John the Baptist was ministering during the time of the reign of Herod. Well, you know the story. Months from when this happened, years at the most, Herod would have John the Baptist beheaded and his head carried in to the banqueting hall on a platter. And you know about Pilate, and you know about Annas and Caiaphas. They were key players in having Jesus crucified. So we modern people, we who have a scholarly sort of what we call a historical critical approach to the gospel stories, you know, we might ask whether this or that detail is absolutely accurate. Did this thing really happen just like this? And that's a good question to ask. But Luke and our medieval ancestors wanted to make it clear that details are nothing. It doesn't matter. This little thing may not be exactly true, but one thing is true. This is history. This really happened. This is not a fairy tale. And Luke wants to do one other thing. By telling us just exactly when this happened. Luke wants us to know, as we get ready to hear this story, that we are in for a rough ride. This is going to be a rough ride. At that time was a very bad time. So John the Baptist and his cousin Jesus were born into a world that no one would want to be born into. Luke makes that pretty clear. Now, we Christians are sometimes accused of being, in denial. We're accused of being sort of delusional by people who aren't believers, just making things up to make ourselves feel better. And sometimes I do hear certain sorts of Christians saying certain sorts of things, preaching a certain sort of gospel that really is delusional, that it really is just naive optimism. People in the name of the gospel say all sorts of ridiculous delusional things. Like here's one that I love. God never gives you more than you can take. Well, you know that's a big lie. That's just not true. I know plenty of people whose lives are far more than they can take. And you do too. Or how about, people who say, you just have faith and it will all turn out fine. Well, that's not exactly the way it was, for example, when we discovered that my mother had Alzheimer's. It did not turn out fine. That's how things happen in fairy tales, happily ever after. But that is not how things happen in real life. That is not how things happen in illo tempore. And real life, not fairy tale life, real life is the time into which John the Baptizer and Jesus were born. Real time. And that's our time. That's the time in which we live. Real time. Real human time. One of the problems with the Christmas season is that it can make wounded people feel even worse than they already do. The Christmas season can make wounded people feel guilty about the fact that they're wounded. It can make them feel that they are somehow not quite like other people, because as everyone knows, it's the most wonderful time of the year, right? It's the most wonderful time of the year. But for a lot of people, it isn't. That's a fairy tale, and all of this Christmas business can just make people feel worse. But that sort of fairy tale living is not the Christian way. Because our life is not lived in a fairy tale. Our life is lived in illo tempore, in real time, in the very same kind of time that John lived in and Jesus lived in, when Herod's soldier was sharpening his sword. Last week, I presided and preached at the 9 o'clock Eucharist, and I mentioned that during my sermon that during this time, when we look at children, there's no getting around the fact that there's something about Christmas and children, right? When we look at children, there's this kind of delight in them, kind of an awe, right? There's an awe. And it's a challenge to us, their wonder. And the question I posed for all of us last week at the 9 was whether or not we can behold the world with the same wonder that children have. And when we see children gazing at the lights on the tree, I wonder if we can have some of that wonder and delight and hold that wonder and delight in our hearts even when those trees are thrown out on the curb. Can we carry that with us? And that's a fact. You know, children during these Christmas days really are like prophets to us. They call us to live with more wonder and to carry it with us through the year. And I believe that. But I need to be a little more clear about that maybe than I was last week at the 9. That's really not simple. That's really not a simple matter. Because children, for the most part, not that children are pain-free, but children, for the most part, can look at the world that way because they don't know the world the way we know the world. They don't know the world in which we older folks know the world. So the challenge for us older folks is to continue to live with wonder and awe, even when we know about the emperor and the other government officials and the religious leaders and all the rest of those people and that stuff that make life, to be honest, very unsettling. All of those things that make it difficult lots of days to have hope. The Gospel of Luke, like all the accounts of Jesus' life, are stories of hope. But they are not fairy tales. And Luke wanted his readers to know right from the beginning, right from this 3rd chapter, he wanted his readers to know from that point that the story of Jesus is a story about reality. Real reality. It's not a fantasy. And so the question that Luke really was inviting his readers, his listeners, to ask was whether they could trust that God's will, God's overarching grand will, that God's will for the world would be done regardless of the sinfulness of human beings and the changes and chances of life. Whether they could trust God was operating in reality or whether reality was simply too much. Martin Luther King, you know, he popularized the notion, you know this thing, that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. You know that. Martin Luther King didn't actually say it. It was a 19th century abolitionist who said it, but it's a good thing to know. The arc of history bends toward justice. And King's notion was that if we could really see the great sweep of history, all of it, we would see that God is drawing everything into God's reign, into God's kingdom, and that at the consummation of all things, the God who is pure love and the God who considers all people to be equal, that God will triumph at the end, that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. And that is the Christian hope. But in the short term, it will not necessarily go well for each one of us. And we can't necessarily even expect to see it getting a whole lot better in our lifetimes. But the Christian hope is that whether we see it or not, God is drawing everything to God's self, and that's a trajectory that ultimately will not fail. So, in illo tempore, if Luke were here today, writing his gospel today, how would he begin it? If Luke wanted to tell us today that Jesus is being born into our world, and they're messengers like John the Baptist, messengers asking us to open our eyes and our hearts to receive him, how would he begin his story? Who are the rulers of this world that he would mention to let us know that this is going to be a rough ride? But that in the midst of the tumult and the chaos, God's reign is coming. Don't you doubt it. In the midst of the tumult and the chaos, God's reign is coming. And the fact is, whether Luke is here today or not, Jesus is being born into our world today. Jesus is being born right now. And if we were to tell the story in our time, how would we begin it? In illo tempore. And then what? And then what? So we need to be honest. It will not go well for us all the time. For some of us, it hardly ever goes well. Sometimes it's just tragic. So John the Baptist has his head cut off, and Jesus is executed by the state and by the religion. People are still being cut to bits. They're being executed by religion and government. You know it. You can listen to an audio recording of it. That's how it was for John, and that's how it was for Jesus, and that's how it is for some people today. And yet Luke tells us he comes. In the midst of it all, he comes. Every day he comes. Into the darkness comes the light. And as John says in the first chapter of his gospel, the light comes into the darkness, and the darkness will not overcome it. but the darkness is wide, and the darkness is deep. And often the light is just a little flicker, just a little flicker. But it is there. Can we see it, that little light in the darkness? Can we see it like children gazing with wonder at Christmas lights and trust that in the end, that little flickering light will win? Not just in our dreams, but in fact.